significantly pointed out that a lot of women were a part of this uprising. Now, of course, we talk about the hierarchy in society at that time, and so when we talk about the hierarchy, we see that women were seen as somewhat lesser in society than the upper class and man. All right? Now, amongst blacks, however, there was always a clear understanding that women had access to plantation houses, they had access to the plantation owners and to certain positions in society, and so a lot of times the black man would depend on the black woman for that access. He himself was seen as a threat directly, whereas the woman were seen given some amount of access. So he would have to use that kind of access to the woman, and so there's a kind of a respect for her position at that time. And so even when Paul Bogle was having this rebellion and these armies, women were always a part of that uprising, right? And so women were somewhat targeted as well in the suppression. A lot of women were abused, whipped, and also tortured for information, especially torturing in terms of for information. Right? Here, Governor Eyre, after being successful in suppressing the uprising, in preventing Paul Bogle from taking over the country, as they had been scared of, in executing George William Gordon, showed us a type of I want to say dictatorship, but he had become he had taken proxy in his own hands and taken over from some of the Senate and all some of the rulings, right? And so a lot of them were quite scared, especially for the fact that he had executed George William Gordon, which had served the assembly. He was then able to convince the assembly to give up their own powers, right? He had argued that it was the people who supported George William Gordon, who George William Gordon in turn helped to develop this rebellion, right? And so it was this voting process that had caused people like George William Gordon, who he is now deeming a criminal, to come to a position where they can defy the government. And so he wanted to move away from representative government, where you could not have persons fly up in the face of the crown like that, right? And so he was able by 1866 to convince them the following year to abandon representative government and move into a crown colony, where of course in a crown colony there is just the direct governorship who is sent here, and he now selects directly the members of the assembly who he works with. So persons are no longer able to vote for persons to represent their communities, right? That is one step that he took. Another step that he also took was the development of the Jamaica Constabulary Force, which is our police force today, right? And that was developed on the what he considered the exemplary work of the Maroons, who was able to be on call at the time to defend the crown and defend the British government at that time. The effectiveness of the Maroons he saw as a organized body, right, led by a captain that was a military captain of the British Army, were effective in quelling these disturbances because they were familiar with the people, they were familiar with the terrain, and they were familiar with the actions of the blacks and the reasoning of the blacks, right? And so he in return identified that to develop a police force rather than to have the independent body of the Maroons. He wanted to have a body that was organized under and responsible to the British. And so he developed the Jamaica Constabulary Force, which was actually the police force, by 1866, which was a much more island-wide and national-wide body of a police force, right? Now, previous to all of these things, he felt himself quite successful. There was actually quite a big inquiry in England as to what was the position and what was some of these things that were taking place, the devastation that had gone in Jamaica. They were quite concerned with it, right? And so they had a commission of inquiry that came to Jamaica in 1866, And throughout that period, there was serious investigations in the areas that were affected. And with that, they found Governor Eyre to be quite cruel and unnecessary in some of his actions. And so this Inquisition found him quite guilty, and he was fired from his position, not thrown in jail or anything of that nature, because the Inquisition could not do that. He would have to be taken up with the courts. And so he was fired, and he remained the rest of his life in England. He was replaced in Jamaica. And Jamaica continued to be a crown colony since those days, up until 1944. Before we were able to actually move into representative government again in Jamaica. Good? Any questions so far? No? In the next time we were able to vote in Jamaica. That's when we got universal adult suffrage, right? And that was led by both the People's National Party and the Jamaica Labour Party, which were two political parties developed out of labor movements in Jamaica. Now, the labor riots of 1938 marked a reoccurrence, really, of the uprising of 1865, where, of course, on plantations, persons had to come up with a rebellion and an uprising against the conditions of the planter class. By this time, these are business, private corporations that are invested in Jamaica, the Frome Sugar Plantation, the Surge Island plantations as well. Even the wharf in Kingston had an uprising as well, labor riots at that time, because of low wages, uncomfortable conditions of the labor class, and so on. And again, as I said, at this time, they were not able to vote at this time, so they could not have politicians to defend their rights on a political sphere, right? And so we saw the rise of people like Sir Alexander Bustamante. We see the rise of St. William Grant, an ex-veteran as well, who helped to develop labor movements in Jamaica. And through these labor movements and the discussion of the rights of the laborer and their wages and other labor rights and conditions, we saw persons moving into these labor movements into political parties and political movements, and the development of the People's National Party and also the Jamaica Labour Party, who were both invested in the development again of universal adult suffrage by 1944. In 1944, the first elections was won by the Jamaica Labour Party, and so Sir Alexander Bustamante becomes the first local premier. And also, eventually by 1955, we have Norman Manley becoming the next premier. They both came together and, Bustamante more so, eventually developed petition towards the Queen for independence in 1962. And so by 1962, we have our first elected national government with the Jamaica Labour Party, again winning that time. Good. Right? Over time of Paul Bogle and George William Gordon and their work towards labor movements and labor rights, Paul Bogle was made a national hero by 1969, and also George William Gordon again as well, for their work again amongst laborers and labor rights. Right. In this section we have contributions by artists, looking at the concept of state violence and state abuse. And so we have a work here by Christopher Irons, who looks at a particular incident called the Brayton brutality, and that saw where police were sent in an operation to accost or arrest persons in a particular community of Brayton in St. Catherine, Portmore area, and unfortunately the persons were all executed by the police, right? And this was seen as an extrajudicial killing, right? And of course all the persons within that squadron were released and exonerated for their actions, right? Now some persons see this as a state abuse, right? And so what the artist does here is he depicts what our police as animals with guns, where he has our police wear a uniform with what we call a red seam, and so he has the animal here with a red seal going down the back, right? And he has the head as a gun. So it's to identify that the police are sometimes like animals with guns. Right? We have a feature here of different videos showing protests and showing incidents of police brutality or military brutality. Again, the military and the police representing the government are work on behalf of the government, they're public sector, right? And so there are times when these people with given authority abuse their powers, and so we have incidents here that are depicted in this video of such occasions, right? At this point, at this area, we have commemorative works of Paul Bogle and George William Gordon. And we have a graphic design here. Also, we have paintings and illustrations and drawings of Paul Bogle. We also see the commemorative coinage, money, bills, as well as stamps in recognition of Paul Bogle, our national hero, and George William Gordon.
Oh, this is what I was telling you guys, the $2 and the $10. This is where we're coming from.
So they don't have these anymore though, right?
Coins. Well, we don't have $2 coins, we only have the $10 coins and the single dollar coin, sorry.
Any questions?
Anything about this uprising?
Yes, there have been movies made in dedication to the uprising. One by Paul Campbell, with Paul Campbell as there are various depictions that have been made, especially by the CPTC. If you contact the CPTC, you should be able to get copies of that, as well as if you contact TVJ as well.
Mm-hmm.
A work by Camille Cheddar. This is the main area of the work. What she does is put images of persons on the bags. Now these bags are degradable. Never hear about. Before the Maroons have a strong Akan base. Right? And the Yoruba and the Akan, in terms of their cosmology, sometimes crisscross. Right? They have different names, but the players are technically the same. Right? And so Ogun is the god of, in Yoruba, is the god of war and metal. Right? And so he's the warrior god. And we know that the Maroons are warriors. Right? And so he uses the reference of the Maroons to the horns, and the reference of the calling on the god to use of metals, a lot of metals as you can see here. And they're actually very pointing, dangerous feeling, right? So they give you a sense of danger. War gives you the sense of danger, ominous, something ominous, right? And so he's technically calling on Ogun, this god of war, who the Maroons would fall under to actually spite the Maroons.